We live in a world of continual fear. Fear of things outside of us, fear of things that generate in our hearts. And then Christ comes and says, don't be afraid. One of the things that is really the call of Christ to freedom are the words that he uses very often. And the words he uses are, don't be afraid. I speak of a theme of the life of Jesus in the Bible, and that's the call to freedom. But there's another recurring experience in the experience of Christ, and that's these words over and over again in the New Testament, hearing, don't be afraid. And it's one of the calls that we have got to face in our life. And I'd like to look at that, and I'd like to look at this word fear and see if we can understand, listening to Christ, how we can start now to really be free people. First of all, let's think for just a moment as we examine the Christian Bible and hear the echo of those words over and over again. The Virgin Mary, a young girl, she's maybe 13 years old, and God comes and says through an angel, I want you to become the mother of the Messiah. But the message is, into that overwhelming experience, don't be afraid. Well, Mary's saying, oh my gosh, you're asking something big of me like that. Don't be afraid. And then we move to the story of Joseph, and here's Joseph. He's a man who's in love with a lady and all ready to get married, and suddenly he finds that she's pregnant, and he knows that he wasn't the father. And this is really confusing, and something that fills him with fear. Fear because he knows that people will want to kill Mary, and his confusion about what people will think about him, and fear becomes very, very strong. And an angel comes to Joseph and says, Joseph, don't be afraid. Oh, and then there's as we move along in this story of the conception of Christ and close to his birth, the story of Zechariah. We hear the angels speaking to the shepherds, don't be afraid. And Jesus calls the apostles and he says, I'm going to call you to leave everything that you have and come follow me and preach the good news of the kingdom of God. Come on, let's do this. And they're blah, 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 leave everything. He says, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And then we find the storm. Remember the time when the apostles were out on the Sea of Galilee and the storm was just blowing all over the place and it was just going, and they thought that they were going to sink. And Christ is up in the front of the boat sleeping. He's sleeping, you know. He'd probably been working so hard that he was exhausted. And they come and they wake him up and they said, Lord, how can you sleep now? Because look at the boat is going to be crashing in. We're all going to die. And Jesus looked at them, you know, and he says, oh, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. We're in the middle of a terrible storm and everything is going to come crashing down on us. And you're saying, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He talks to the storm and, ooh, the storm stops. Don't be afraid. Wow. And then there's that other time, and it's another scene where there was water. They were out in the middle of the lake. It was night, and they were rowing, coming towards shore, and all of a sudden they looked over, and there was Jesus walking on water. Get this, walking on water. And they thought it was a ghost. And they started screaming, and he yells out, and he says, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. What do you think? What do you think? Can that message touch our hearts? Can we hear Christ shouting those words out? Not just 2,000 years ago, but can we hear that call today right into our own hearts, whatever is going on in our lives. The message of don't be afraid comes even more. Remember the little 12-year-old girl that has died? Oh, and it's such a sad situation. And Jesus walks into the scene where a 12-year-old girl has just died, and everybody is they're yelling and screaming, and it's all terrible. And what does he say? He says to Jairus the father, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He comes into Jerusalem, and as he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, oh, there's crowds of people there, and the apostles are really aware that when Jesus has left his Galilee up to the north and come down into Jerusalem, he's coming into the real antagonism, the people that are after him. And he says, in the midst of what can be a fearful situation, don't be afraid. Even at the Last Supper, when the death is very, very close, he says to the apostles once again, don't be afraid. And then in the victory of the resurrection, all of a sudden everything had fallen apart with the death of Christ, and now here are these women that coming into the tomb, and there isn't anybody in the tomb, and they don't know what happens, and Christ comes and says, Mary, don't be afraid. Well, I want to say that to you because you and I are living in a world in which fear is a very big factor. Fear is what is taking away our freedom. And remember, I started talking to you about the theme of Christ's life was be free. Be free. Don't allow these laws to hold you down. Don't allow these customs to hold you back. Allow yourself with great freedom to reach out and accept the good news of the kingdom of God. You know, that's what he was saying. And he said, I know that one of the biggest problems for you to find that freedom is the fear that plagues you.